When you think of the world's toughest prisons, you probably think of places like Alcatraz, or maybe the infamous prisons in Russia. But what if I told you some of the most brutal prisons exist in South Africa? These are places where even the toughest criminals fear for their lives, and every day is a battle for survival. Today, we're going to dive into the dark, gritty world of South Africa's maximum security prisons versus American maximum security prisons, exploring what makes them so dangerous and why they strike fear into anyone who steps inside. South Africa is a country that has faced deep challenges, from apartheid to high crime rates and political unrest. But hidden behind the veil of this turbulent history are some of the world's most dangerous and unforgiving prisons. These are institutions where survival isn't just about obeying the rules. It's about living through chaos and brutality. In this video, we'll explore what makes these prisons the hardest in the world, and what life is like for the inmates who live inside them. South Africa has a unique and complex prison system. It's a country that has struggled with high levels of violent crime and has a prison population that reflects the social unrest within the country. The South African government operates a range of prisons, but the most notorious are the maximum security facilities, where hardened criminals, some of the most dangerous individuals in the country, are housed. To understand what makes these prisons so brutal, we first need to take a look at the social and historical context in which they were built. South Africa's prison system has evolved over centuries, starting under colonial rule and continuing through the apartheid era, which saw political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela, locked up in horrific conditions. These historical circumstances still shape the prison culture today. The prisons in South Africa are overcrowded, underfunded, and often filled with criminals who are not afraid to use violence to maintain power. There is a constant undercurrent of fear and violence, where prisoners have little to no protection from each other. Many inmates form gangs to protect themselves, and these gangs often exert control over the prison environment. One of the most notorious prisons in South Africa is Pollsmoor Prison. Located in Cape Town, this maximum security facility has housed some of South Africa's most dangerous criminals, including former President Nelson Mandela. Pollsmoor's reputation is rooted in its extreme overcrowding, where cells meant for a few hundred inmates often hold thousands. The constant pressure of too many people in too little space leads to fights, stabbings, and sometimes even riots. But Pollsmoor isn't the only infamous institution. Robben Island, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was once a maximum security prison where political prisoners, including Mandela, were kept in harsh conditions. The prison's isolated location in the cold waters off the coast of Cape Town made it difficult for prisoners to escape, but it was also a symbol of the oppressive apartheid regime. The harsh conditions, coupled with the psychological toll of isolation, broke many individuals, but it also produced some of the country's most iconic political figures. What makes South African prisons particularly notorious is the role of gangs. Unlike many other parts of the world, South African prisons are heavily influenced by gang culture. These gangs, such as the 28, 26, and 27, control almost every aspect of life within the walls. From who gets access to basic resources like food and medicine, to controlling the prison economy, these gangs are a powerful force in shaping daily life inside. The 28 are perhaps the most feared gang. They control most of the violent crime in the prison system, and their power extends far beyond the prison walls. The culture of violence they foster within these prisons is reinforced by the sheer number of gangs and the constant struggle for power. Inmates often join these gangs for protection, but doing so comes at a steep price. Loyalty to the gang is absolute, and betrayal is met with swift and brutal punishment. Life inside a South African prison is often a matter of survival. It's not just about avoiding trouble. It's about making sure you're not seen as weak or as someone who can't defend themselves. Weakness in many cases is a death sentence. One of the most disturbing aspects of South Africa's prisons is the violence that happens behind closed doors. Prison officers, in many cases, turn a blind eye to the gang violence that permeates everyday life. Inmates often take matters into their own hands, resulting in widespread abuse, including beatings, stabbings, and even murder. Prisoners are often left to fend for themselves in the face of this brutality, and many have no choice but to join a gang or face a lonely and painful death. A notorious example of prison brutality can be seen in the case of CMAX Prison. Known as one of South Africa's toughest and most secure prisons, CMAX is a high-security facility designed to house the most dangerous offenders. Its brutal conditions have earned it a reputation as a place where even the most hardened criminals face terrifying isolation and abuse. Inmates spend up to 23 hours a day locked in their cells, with little to no human contact. The oppressive nature of this prison is said to break even the toughest individuals, with many reporting psychological breakdowns and extreme mental health issues after prolonged stays. Another key feature of South Africa's toughest prisons is the overcrowding. South African prisons are notorious for holding far more inmates than they were designed for. In some cases, prisons that were built to house a few hundred inmates now hold thousands. This extreme overcrowding makes it almost impossible for prison authorities to maintain order and safety. With too many people in too small a space, violence is inevitable. The prison system is stretched thin, and the resources needed to properly manage and rehabilitate prisoners are often lacking. There are stories of prisoners being forced to sleep on the floor without enough beds or basic amenities. Overcrowding also leads to a lack of proper health care, which can be disastrous for those who suffer from chronic illness or mental health issues. In this kind of environment, the focus is not on rehabilitation, but rather on survival. Inmates are often left to their own devices, and as a result, many of them emerge from these prisons more broken and dangerous than when they entered. The role of corruption and mismanagement. South African prisons are also plagued by corruption and mismanagement. Prison guards are often paid poorly, and some resort to bribery and other illegal activities in exchange for perks, such as money, drugs, or even sexual favors. This culture of corruption extends throughout the system, with reports of prison officials turning a blind eye to violence, or even actively participating in it. In some cases, gang leaders inside the prison have more control than the prison staff themselves. They dictate who gets access to resources, who gets to live, and who suffers. Prison officials may receive bribes from gang leaders to ensure that their rules are followed, leading to an environment where the inmates, not the authorities, are in charge. The impact of these brutal conditions on the prisoners cannot be overstated. Many inmates suffer from severe mental health issues as a result of their time in prison. Long periods of isolation, constant threats of violence, and the lack of proper care can cause serious psychological trauma. PTSD, anxiety, depression, and other mental health disorders are common among those who have spent significant time in South African prisons. Prisoners often face difficulties reintegrating into society once they are released. The lack of rehabilitation and the trauma they experience inside leave them ill-prepared to re-enter the outside world. Many ex-prisoners end up back in the system, caught in a cycle of crime and incarceration that is hard to escape. Despite these conditions, South Africa has made some efforts to reform its prison system. There have been calls for better treatment of prisoners, improved conditions, and a focus on rehabilitation. However, progress has been slow, and the problems remain deeply entrenched. For many, the prison system is a symbol of a larger societal failure, one that is rooted in poverty, inequality, and systemic violence. Efforts to reduce overcrowding and improve conditions have met with mixed success. Some of South Africa's most notorious prisons remain as brutal as ever, while others are slowly being reformed. But change is hard to come by, especially in a system that is so deeply ingrained in the country's history. Part 2. American Maximum Security Prisons. When we talk about dangerous prisons, it's hard not to think about the United States. Home to the largest prison system in the world, America's maximum security prisons are some of the most notorious in the globe. These prisons are not just holding facilities, they are often grim, violent battlegrounds where inmates struggle for power, survival, and in many cases, a sense of control over their bleak lives. So, how do America's maximum security prisons compare to the brutal conditions of South Africa's toughest facilities? Let's dive into the terrifying world of American prisons and see what makes them one of the harshest systems in the world. America's prison system is known for its size, its severity, and its shocking reality. With over 2 million people incarcerated, the U.S. has the largest prison population in the world, and its maximum security prisons are home to some of the most violent and dangerous criminals imaginable. The conditions inside these prisons are far from humane. Overcrowded, underfunded, and often chaotic, American maximum security prisons are a microcosm of larger societal issues like racial inequality, economic hardship, and systemic violence. These prisons are infamous not only for their dangerous inhabitants, but also for the very culture of violence that defines them. In this video, we'll look into the shocking details of some of the US's most notorious prisons and explore how they compare to the brutal systems in South Africa. America's toughest prisons are often located in isolated, remote areas, built to house criminals who are considered the worst of the worst. These facilities are designed to be places where violence is not just a possibility, but an expectation. Inmates are treated with suspicion and hostility, and guards, often overwhelmed by the sheer number of inmates and the dangerous nature of their charges, struggle to maintain order. One of the most infamous maximum security prisons in the United States is ADX Florence in Colorado. Known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, ADX Florence is home to the nation's most dangerous criminals, terrorists, serial killers, and high-profile gang leaders. ADX Florence is a supermax facility designed for complete isolation. Inmates are locked in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, only leaving their cells for 1 hour of exercise in a small, enclosed area. The conditions are so harsh that many inmates experience severe mental health issues due to the extreme isolation. The culture in these prisons is built around control, not rehabilitation. Guards are not just security officers. They are seen as enforcers who uphold the rigid hierarchy of power within the prison walls. For inmates, every day is a fight for respect, survival, and sometimes just to keep their sanity. Similar to South Africa's prison system, violence is rampant in American maximum security prisons. But in the U.S., it's not just gang violence that dominates. The prison system itself creates an environment where violence is encouraged. Prison fights are common, and many times they are fueled by small disputes over food, personal space, or power. Take San Quentin State Prison, for example. Located in California, it is one of the oldest and most infamous prisons in the United States. San Quentin houses some of the state's most dangerous criminals, including those on death row. The prison is notorious for its overcrowding, with more than double the number of inmates it was designed to hold. This overcrowding leads to constant tension and violence among the inmates. In addition, the prison has been the site of numerous riots, the most notable being the 1971 San Quentin prison riot, which was sparked by tensions between black and white inmates. San Quentin's culture is shaped by a ruthless gang hierarchy. Gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Guerrilla Family, and the Mexican Mafia exert significant influence within the prison walls. These gangs often control the illegal economy inside the prison, including the trafficking of drugs, weapons, and even contraband phones. Inmates who are not affiliated with these gangs are often left vulnerable, forced to form alliances for protection, or risk being targeted. Overcrowding is one of the biggest challenges faced by American prisons, especially maximum security facilities. Prisons in the U.S. are designed for a specific number of inmates, but due to mass incarceration and tough-on-crime policies, many of these facilities are packed far beyond their intended capacity. For example, Rikers Island, one of the most notorious jails in New York, is notoriously overcrowded. Although Rikers Island is a jail rather than a prison, it houses individuals awaiting trial, as well as convicted criminals, and has been the scene of regular violence and inmate abuse. The overcrowding at places like Rikers Island leads to problems beyond violence. The infrastructure can't keep up with the sheer number of prisoners, resulting in issues like insufficient access to healthcare, poor sanitation, and a lack of meaningful programs to help inmates rehabilitate. The mental health toll on prisoners is enormous, with many suffering from untreated psychiatric conditions. A 2016 report found that 50% of inmates at Rikers Island had a diagnosed mental illness, and many of them were confined to solitary confinement, worsening their mental health issues. Prisoners in American maximum security facilities like Rikers Island and San Quentin are often left to rot, with little hope of rehabilitation or reintegration into society. The prison system in the U.S. is often described as a cycle. Prisoners who are released end up right back in the system because they are not given the tools to succeed outside of prison. Solitary confinement is one of the most controversial aspects of American prisons, especially in supermax facilities. Inmates who are placed in solitary confinement are kept in isolation, often for months or even years at a time, with minimal human contact. At ADX Florence, for instance, the 23-hour isolation schedule is designed to break the spirit of the most dangerous inmates. Prisoners in these conditions are given only basic necessities, including food, clothing, and a bed, but are otherwise kept in their cells with little stimulation. This environment, combined with a lack of social interaction, can have devastating effects on the mental health of inmates. Psychologists and human rights organizations have long condemned solitary confinement, citing its potential to cause permanent psychological damage. The isolation, the lack of sensory stimulation, and the extreme boredom lead to conditions like anxiety, depression, and even hallucinations. Many inmates who have spent extended periods in solitary confinement come out of the experience deeply disturbed and unable to function in society. Like in South Africa, American prisons also struggle with corruption and mismanagement. While many prison guards are dedicated to their jobs, the system itself is riddled with issues of abuse of power, bribery, and exploitation. Prison officials may look the other way when gangs control parts of the prison, or when officers accept bribes in exchange for smuggling contraband into the facility. The private prison industry in the U.S. also contributes to corruption. These for-profit prisons often cut corners to increase their bottom line. Reports have shown that private prisons have lower staff-to-inmate ratios, which leads to more violence and less oversight. The government's lack of regulation and the push for higher profits contribute to the prison system's failure to reform or improve conditions for inmates. Despite the brutality and corruption, there are calls for prison reform in the U.S. Advocates argue that the system's focus on punishment over rehabilitation does more harm than good. The United States has some of the highest recidivism rates in the world, with nearly 70% of released prisoners returning to prison within 3 years. Many believe that the solution lies in better rehabilitation programs, mental health support, and a focus on restorative justice rather than retribution. In recent years, some states have begun to implement reforms aimed at reducing mass incarceration. These include eliminating mandatory minimum sentences, improving parole systems, and diverting nonviolent offenders to rehabilitation programs rather than prison. However, these reforms are still in their early stages, and change is slow. The conditions in American maximum security prisons are harrowing, and they reflect the larger issues within the U.S. justice system. Whether it's overcrowding, violence, corruption, or the widespread use of solitary confinement, America's prison system is one of the toughest and most brutal in the world. Yet, despite the grim reality, there are voices calling for change. Prison reform advocates believe that we can move away from a system of punishment and instead create one focused on rehabilitation, support, and a chance for redemption. But until that happens, America's maximum security prisons will remain a harsh and unforgiving environment, as dangerous as any in the world.